Hello everyone. I wanted to put together a video to talk a little bit about how psychology has gotten its start. So what I really want to cover here is a bit of history of psychology, some of the people in play, uh, and their influence and impact upon the field, how it all got started. Now, before I get into this, let me say this. I could spend an awful lot of time covering this. There are courses on the history of psychology that last 16 weeks, an entire semester. So what I'm going to give you is sort of a brief overview of how we got started and why and some of the major players. And as the semester progresses, we'll hit upon more people just as we explain concepts and so on. But let's get started. When it comes to the history of psychology, first of all, you got to understand just how old we truly are, or in this case, are not. Astronomy is the study of the stars and heavenly bodies, looking up at the lights in the sky. And we know that this has been around for about 10,000 years because of the drawings we find in caves and things of that sort. We know that people have marveled at that for a long, long time. Mathematics has been around for probably about 7,500 years. We say that based on the fact of the pyramids, the Roman arches, and things of that sort. An understanding of math and geometry has been with us for quite a while. Trying to understand the human body, medicine, yep, that's been with us now for some 5,000 years in some regards or another, and we've learned a lot and we've made our fair share of mistakes. But psychology is in its infancy. We really truly are the newborn baby that has just entered the game, considering that some have been around 10,000 and 7,500 and 5,000 years. And we've been around probably about 150, 160 years, and that's about it. Okay, so we're sort of new. Now, psychology actually got its start way back in the era of the philosophers, such as Socrates, the Greek philosophers, and Aristotle, things of that sort. Now, these individuals did not teach intro psych. There was no such thing. What they did as philosophers was they talked about the differences in individuals, okay? And a lot of their explanation of differences between people and their explanations of human behavior was really based off of common sense. They didn't do research, they didn't do analysis, they didn't do testing, they didn't do systematic observations, correlations, none of that. They just used common sense. And to this day, there are people out there who seem to believe that common sense is really all you need. It's what they used way back in the era of the Greeks. It's called rationalism. That's what we call it today. But, a lot of people still believe to this day that you don't need to do a lot of research, just use some common sense and you can figure out human behavior, the behavior of organisms. Well, consider the following. Consider if you were to do an experiment. And in this experiment, you created a wooden box. And in the wooden box, you built it high enough, all right, that you could put a small dog in the box. And maybe in phase one of this, you put a metal grid along the floor and speakers at each end. And you create the box in such a way that you can send an electrical current through the floor. Okay? Now imagine putting a dog in a box and there is no hurdle. The box on one side has a space and there's no hurdle as you see in the picture. It's just a solid piece of wood down the middle. So the dog is stuck. It's only in one side. It can't get out. And you do the following. Now you couldn't do this today. You get in an awful lot of trouble for it. But you turn around and you put a dog in one end of the box. You hook a speaker up to it and you create a buzzing sound in the speaker followed by about 1 second's worth of electrical shock to the floor. It wouldn't take long for your dog to turn around and get terrified of the fact that it's stuck in a box with no avenue of escape, and it hears that buzzer go off and it gets a mild shock and it hurts. And you do it over and over and over again. You hit make the buzzer sound and then you shock the floor. Okay? After doing that enough, the dog is absolutely terrified. Imagine then taking the dog out of the box, maybe put it in the next room, while you replace that solid piece of wood with a hurdle, a piece of wood that now allows the dog to jump from one side to the other to escape the shock. Okay, now I'm paraphrasing the original study. I'm well aware that I'm paraphrasing the original study, but I'm just trying to explain. If you bring the dog back and it's scared to death and you put it back in the box on the same side, rationalism, common sense, what is that dog going to do? And common sense would tell you that dog is going to turn around and jump over the hurdle from one side to escape the punishment and go to the other side. Now, a long time ago, this experiment was conducted, and the dog was electrocuted, not to the point of hurting it permanently, but, basically receiving a shock. A hurdle was installed, the dog was put back in the box, and they started again. And simply put, the dog did not jump to the other side. When it heard the buzzer, it stayed and took the shock. And it did that repeatedly. The researchers at the time thought, well, maybe the dog doesn't understand that it has an avenue of escape. I remember reading at one point, an assistant was asked, stand next to the box. When the buzzer goes off, you've got about 3 seconds or whatever the time was. I want you to reach in, pick up the dog, and physically put it on the other side. Make it aware it has an avenue of escape. And they tried that. And when the buzzer went off and the researcher reached into the box, the dog bit him and stayed and took the shock. Okay? Now, some people would say that what you've got there is a stupid dog, because no human would stay in an abusive situation and fight any opportunity to get out, would they? Unfortunately, it happens all the time. We hear stories of people suffering from domestic violence and an opportunity to walk out the door, and they won't do it for a host of reasons. We're no different than that dog in that regard. The point I'm trying to make is this. Human behavior cannot always be explained with common sense. You cannot rely on common sense alone to explain human behavior. If that's all it took, the dog, while punished, would jump to the other side, and anyone who's in an abusive situation would simply walk out the door, and yet that does not necessarily happen. It's called learned helplessness. We'll talk about that later. All right? In the end, this is why we do research. We have to do research because basically it's not enough to just assume, all right? Common sense will explain everything. All right. We like to think that when it comes to psychology, okay, we're actually doing research and things like that, we like to think that a lot of the great things of the world started in the United States, and a lot of them did. But psychology, simply put, is not one of them. Psychology got its start in Germany, okay? And really the father of scientific psychology is a man by the name of Wilhelm Wundt, or Wilhelm Wundt. If you speak any German, a lot of W's are pronounced with V's, Wilhelm Wundt, okay? He turned around and was at the University of Leipzig, Leipzig, and he wasn't a psychologist. There was no psychology degree. He was a physiologist, and he was studying consciousness. Actually, what he was studying was how people sense and how people perceive. Okay? At what point do they begin to detect a sound, a smell, a sight, and so on, a touch, a taste? And at what point do they, perceive it, and so on and so forth? By doing studies of sensation and perception, Wilhelm Wundt was studying consciousness, and he is attributed as being the father of scientific psychology, not Sigmund Freud. Okay, so keep that in mind. He did research. He taught at the University of Leipzig. This is what he did for a living. Okay, and he really is the first one. Some other people worth noting are some of his followers. I won't worry you with the names. Wolfgang Kohler, Maximilian Wertheimer. These were actually students of Wundt's at one point, and they studied consciousness too. But while Wundt would study sensation and do research on sensation and then put his research aside and do research on perception, the Gestalt psychologists studied consciousness by studying the whole interaction of how we sense and how that influences our perceptions, and how our perceptions influence our sensations, how they go together, how sensation and perception go together. Gestalt in German means whole, W-H-O-L-E, holistic psychology, okay? And so they continued his research by basically teaching more of a holistic way of looking at the consciousness by putting the two together. Another gentleman worth noting is this man, William James. William James is the father of applied psychology. James did not study parts, studying sensation and then perception. He did not study holistic, looking at them together. William James wanted to see how the consciousness functioned under certain circumstances. Why is it that people act the way they do under certain circumstances? Why do they carry on the way they do? Why is it one person observes a horrific accident, automobile accident, and is bothered by it for a day while someone else turns around and is obsessed with what they've seen for weeks on end? How is the consciousness functioning? That is what William James would study, okay? In his lifetime, James wrote over 20,000 pages of research on applied psychology, okay? That's why we call him the father of applied psychology, trying to understand how the consciousness functions. There is Edward Bradford Titchener. Titchener learned from Wundt, and Titchener was a follower of Wundt's. And Titchener actually took psychology, this new field, left Germany, and came to the United States to teach. He was really the first to come to the U.S. And so that is why we note him here. He came and he taught at, I believe it was the University of Loyola in Chicago, which at that time was the turn of the century, 1800s into 1900s. And he gave psychology a name. He gave Wundt's concepts a name. He called them structuralism. So he was teaching the structure of the consciousness over here. So he was the first to bring it to the U.S. There is also a gentleman worth noting. His name is John Watson. Now, everyone I've mentioned up to this point, Wilhelm Wundt, the Gestalts, William James, Titchener, all of these people studied consciousness. So they were studying mental processes. Remember the definition. Psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. Watson often asked his colleagues and friends, you study consciousness. How much does the consciousness weigh? Or what does it look like? And many couldn't answer that question. They tried to describe the brain, but he said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. What does the consciousness look like? Draw me a picture of one's consciousness, and stuff like that. Nobody knew. He said, I agree. I don't know either. Maybe we should focus on outward behavior, things that we can observe, things that we can quantify, and that's what he began to do. So John Watson is known something as the father of behaviorism, okay? These are some of the people that are involved with the creation of psychology. But there's one more worth noting. What about Freud? What about good old Sigmund Freud? People, when you ask them about psychology, don't mention Titchener, they don't mention Wundt, they don't mention Watson or any of the rest, they mention Freud. Well, Freud is the father of psychoanalytic psychology. And he actually believed in something that none of the rest did, and this is why we know him better than anyone else. Freud believed that there was a hidden consciousness, a level of consciousness within our consciousness, all right? And he often believed that this deeper level of consciousness, the subconscious as he originally called it, this deeper level of consciousness was very animalistic. It was always watching. Your consciousness, your outward behavior, knowing what's going on, has a hidden inner animal. And he did. He turned around and told people that you have an inner consciousness and it's somewhat animalistic. It's very primal in its way. And a lot of people sort of like that. You mean I've got a little bit of primal animal in me, huh? Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Okay? So he had a fascinating theory, and that's why we remember him. But also, He practiced psychology instead of just simply studying it. He went out and got a couch and turned around and, tell me about your mother. Tell me about your childhood. He tried to apply it. And that is why Freud is the person we think of the most when we think of psychology. Okay? There are a lot of other people to psychology, but that's a good start. And that's all I want you to know for this video. Thanks a bunch.